I think we'll get started. Welcome everybody to CSIS and to today's CSIS Statesman's Forum with His Excellency Pravin Gordhan, Finance Minister of South Africa. Thank you also. This was very short notice and we're delighted that you could join us. It will be available live webcast and up on our web tomorrow. I'm Jennifer Cooke, Director of the Africa Program. We analyze and try to make sense of emerging trends in political, economic, and security spheres in Africa. Mr. Minister, we're delighted to welcome you to Washington and to CSIS. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about South Africa and the priorities for economic resurgence. I think your visit could not be more timely. South Africa finds itself in rough waters right now. The headlines are gloomy, slow growth, and we heard the IMF downgraded the forecast, rising debt, a precipitous decline in the rand, all have shaken investor confidence and accelerated capital outflow. The mining sector has been hit hard by the low commodity prices. El Nino is having a devastating effect on the agricultural sector, and we had a conference recently on El Nino, and the worst is expected to come in later in 2016, early 2017. On top of this is all on top of enduring challenges in income inequality, high unemployment, and pressing needs in education and health. But I think today's gloomy headline shouldn't detract from South Africa's many strengths. It has one of the most sophisticated financial and banking sectors in Africa. It has a manufacturing sector that would be the envy of many African states, strong judicial systems, a lively and feisty independent press, a politically engaged citizenry, and increasingly strong opposition parties, which may not suit the ANC, but it's a positive development in a democracy. It also has a number of leading figures within the government and the ruling party, Minister Gordhan among them, a vision of probity, of competence, and of commitment. And so I think we should not be fatalistic about South Africa. It's weathered much tougher storms in the past. We're honored to host the minister today. It's going to be hard to do justice to his biography. But he, for those of you who don't know him, he was a leading figure in the liberation struggle, a member of the ANC underground through Operation Vula, and a key figure in the CODESA negotiations that paved the way for democratic elections. He served from 1999 to 2009 as head of the South Africa Revenue Service, which under his leadership became one of the most respected agencies, government agencies in South Africa. He was a finance minister from 2009 to 2014. In December, for those of you that haven't been following South African news, after then Finance Minister Nene was abruptly replaced and a big public outcry and a precipitous fall in the rand, Minister Gordhan was reappointed as finance minister, recognized as someone who could restore investor confidence, who had the confidence of the South African public, and of many within the ruling ANC. Mr. Minister, you have a difficult course to chart ahead between political rocks and economic hard places, but the stakes are very high for South Africa. South Africa is such an important, sometimes neglected partner of the United States. We sometimes forget how important it is. And this is not just in government-to-government relationships, but in trade and investment, in health and health sciences and research, in university exchanges, and importantly, the inspiration that we Americans and many in the world have drawn from South Africa's transformation. So we are all very eager to see you succeed in the job ahead. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much for, at very short notice, responding to Jennifer's invitation. And in particular, good wishes to the fellow South Africans that are in the audience. I'm also accompanied by Ambassador Mshlangu, who's the South African ambassador to the United States. So would you welcome him as well before... He might just report me, for not acknowledging his presence. Let me say a few words about some of the issues that Jennifer has raised, and then avail ourselves to an interaction between yourselves and hopefully myself and others in the audience as well. South Africa has always been, and I imagine for some time to come, be one of these fascinating countries in the world, coming as it does from the kind of history that many, if not most of you, are familiar with, a country that is identified with the Mandelas, the Zulus, Katraras, and importantly identified often with a catastrophic image, a country that will fall apart in the early 1990s, if you recall. That's just some 20 odd years ago, and one that has made a huge success of itself, both in terms of getting the economy on the right path, but importantly addressing the needs and concerns of the vast majority of South Africans, largely black, who've been historically marginalized economically or as far as health, education, housing, and other basic services are concerned. So if you had to look at the statistics over the last 21 years of democracy, you will find that even our opponents, whether on the political benches or amongst the research institutes, will acknowledge that on all of these many areas, we've made formidable progress. But nothing in life is a straight upward line, as you know. There will always be periods during which one or other kind of difficulty, political or economic, will beset one of our countries, and particularly in the current climate, many of our countries. And it's in that kind of context that I'll describe some of the challenges that South Africa has and how we are going about attempting to resolve them. But if one looks at the global context, for the past 18 months to 2 years, we've had, following on the May 2013 taper tantrum in the recovery period after the recession, a second bout of very negative sentiments towards emerging markets. And that included South Africa. So many of our currencies have depreciated quite significantly, some more than others, but they're heading basically in the same direction. The commodity prices and demand have changed quite remarkably from that period as well, and that has impacted on all commodity exporting and producing countries, amongst which South Africa is one. Although mining is not a very big part of the South African GDP, exports of mineral products certainly is. Some 50% of our exports is dependent on that particular commodity. Similarly, the slowdown in the global growth, which you'll hear a lot more about over the next 72 hours or so, as the World Economic Outlook from yesterday indicates, is once again a negative story, a story which says that the globe is once again shrinking as far as growth is concerned, that this shrinkage is happening virtually across the economies, both advanced and emerging market or developing economies, and that factors such as lower demand, lower investment, business risk averseness, a large amount of capital that's still flushing around the world looking for yield, capital which is leaving emerging markets, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but nonetheless creating a fair amount of volatility, both in asset prices and in the domestic environments within emerging markets itself. And all of these factors, I think, are leading in a troublesome direction, if one had to say. A direction where a lot of the energies of global institutions and global discourse, if you like, is beginning to focus on crises, whether it's the migration crisis in Europe, the destabilization that's happening in the Middle East, or individual conflict areas that are taking place in one or other country, or pandemics like the Zika pandemic that has just been managed in South America. And one of the questions we've got to ask ourselves is this crisis orientation one which is going to disrupt the kind of focus that development, growth, and jobs was getting in the kind of ambit within which we were saying it's very important to actually have multiple poles of growth and demand, which was a narrative post 2009, 2010 that we were beginning to develop. Suddenly the world has shrunken. Suddenly we've all become more concerned about national or regional interest than the kind of global concerns and perspective which informed us that it's important for all parts of the world to grow. It's important for all parts of the world to have social mobility within their countries and economic progress in their countries, because that's how global demand is going to increase over a period of time. And so the second area in the shift between crises and development and growth is the impact of technology, for example, on jobs as well. Felt more directly in some of the countries that we come from, and it's beginning to impact on other countries as well, whether it's the Uber phenomenon and its disruptive capabilities or other technological developments which begin to impact on job creation and above all job certainty, which is, I think, having a major impact upon societies and the way in which they view elites. And more of our discourse globally is now taking place around the areas of concern around inequality, the separation between what you in the US will call 1% and 99%, others might call it 10% and 90%, but the issue is the same, that the trust between, or trust levels between the majority of lower middle class and working class people, or in our case, unemployed people as well, and people who find themselves in elite positions is one that is actually growing. There's also a retreat one observes into what I might call interest hubs. So with the oil price falling, for example, oil-producing countries from the African continent and elsewhere in the world group together in order to defend their interests. I imagine coal-producing countries and other commodity-producing countries in one or other forum will be creating their own hub and looking at their immediate interests as well. What all of this will do as we get into the future to finding some coherent global discourse and focus is something that is yet to be determined. But one of the risks that we need to avoid is going back to the past. Going back to the past in the sense that we once again create a North versus South discourse and dynamic. In other words, the issues preoccupying developed countries or advanced economies begin to preoccupy those countries, forgetting the important role that they have to play in the development of the globe as a whole. And similarly, in the South, we begin to focus on our own narrow issues and concerns, and in the immediate, probably next year or so, fiscal management, monetary management, and more generally economic management and the search for stability and growth and job creation, and whether and what kind of assistance countries that find themselves in difficulty are going to get from either particular countries or particular institutions, and how those institutions and countries respond to the kinds of needs people have in these particular areas is going to create, I think, an interesting set of dynamics as well. As far as South Africa is concerned, the recession was, of course, manufactured in the United States, I have to regrettably say. And we were going fine. We had 4% growth in 2008, 2009. We had a fiscal surplus for the first time in our history, or certainly the democratic history, and our debt to GDP ratio was below 25% at the time. And we were paying a pittance in terms of interest on debt at that stage. And then came along the recession and all of its after effects and threw us into a different curve, some by choice, some by force. The choice, of course, that we made as a new government in May 2009 under President Zuma's presidency was that we have the fiscal space to in fact borrow and ensure that we don't lose the hard-fought victories and gains that we had made in terms of delivery on the various social needs that people had. But of course, we didn't then bounce back, except for 2010, to beyond 2% in terms of growth and everything that comes with growth, and then began a period of decline in terms of the growth numbers, and equally a decline, but not an unmanageable decline, I would argue, on the fiscal front as well. And so we then confront a new set of issues, which then begin to, in addition to the after effects of the recession, compound the problems that we confront in terms of economic growth. The first and most well-known is the electricity shortage, and I'll come back to that point in a moment, for which we have clear plans at one level and a multiplicity of energy sources: coal, renewables, potentially gas, nuclear, all of which will become part of the equation. All of them are, in fact, part of the energy equation, but one which is going to take us a few years to get back to the kind of equilibrium that we had in South Africa some years ago. The second, obviously, is declining confidence and investment, particularly from the private sector. But here again, are issues that we can begin to address, and I'll tell you how in a moment. And then the El Nino effect has introduced quite a significant drought last year, and one that we just about beginning to get out of, although not adequately at this point. So how are we addressing some of these issues? On the energy front, some of the early units of this big Medupi power station are now coming into operation and beginning to supply some 800 megawatts to the grid. And over time, we have already added some 2,000 megawatts and will add eventually 6,000 megawatts through an independent power producer program as far as renewables is concerned. Now, this particular venture has attracted some 100 billion rands in investment, some of it on a PPP basis, some of it in terms of private sector investment, and is amongst the best run IPPs in the world, and has attained quite a reputation for itself. On the issue of boosting confidence and private investment, we have a presidential business working group, but also have been intensely meeting with business leaders in South Africa since the early part of this year, and getting very positive responses to taking co-responsibility for creating the right kind of optimism and positivity about the economy. And I think that over the next few weeks and months, we'll be able to show some very concrete results. In fact, just before I left for Washington on Tuesday, we actually had some interesting discussions with a group of business people who've been managing 3 streams of work. How do we avoid a downgrade? How do we boost entrepreneurship and small businesses in South Africa? And how do we get tourism and agriculture and other sectors increasing the level of investment and dynamism within those sectors and other sectors as well? And I'm very hopeful that given a bit of time, this dynamic will become quite an intense one and a positive one. Equally, there's interactions between labor and government and labor and business. And on a number of issues, we seem to be closing the gap, and soon we hope there will be announcements that will actually demonstrate that, whether it is on balloting before strikes actually take place, the management of strikes, where we've already passed legislation which allows an institution called the CCMA to intervene well before strikes go out of control, to shorten the period of strikes, and also closing of the gap on various views on the question of the minimum wage. The tourism sector, for example, so this is the positive side of a weak currency, has shown tremendous growth in recent, I think the last 6 months or so, we've seen a 16% increase in tourists coming into South Africa. So even the negative side has its positive edge as well, and we've got to utilize these opportunities that we have. In terms of boosting economic growth, over and above the traditional sectors which require either new ways of regulating them or removing constraints on doing business, both at a national level and at a city level in South Africa. There are also new areas of research and innovation that are taking place, new exploratory processes in terms of what we call the oceans economy. We have one of the largest coastlines on the African continent, so there are lots of possibilities in that area as well. We are facilitating the investment of South African companies into the rest of the African continent, and that process has played a very important part in developing African economies and diversifying them. And South Africa is the single biggest FDI investor in the continent outside of the resource area. Let me round up by saying, and there's many other areas we could talk about, but we've got to, and I believe notwithstanding our political developments in the recent past, which merely reinforce one very important point that arises from our negotiations in the early 1990s as to what kind of shape will our democracy take. And at that time, Mr. Mashlangu and I were both involved in this process. We settled on the idea of a constitutional state, that the Constitution is the supreme law of our country, and that the Constitutional Court is at the apex of our judicial system in South Africa. And that it's important to get all three arms of the state, and you know it well from your own American context, to work efficiently, impartially, and fairly in order for democracies to thrive and to do well. And in recent times, you've heard the Constitutional Court playing a very important role in clarifying the role of the Office of the Public Protector and the decisions and recommendations, or what are called remedial actions of the Public Protector. And following on that judgment, there are processes underway to establish exactly how much needs to be paid by the President, which is a task that the National Treasury has been given. And we have some 6 weeks or so to finish that task, and we've begun to actually do it. And that reinforces confidence in our judicial system and our Constitution, and gets people in South Africa a lot more aware of the value and the values that the Constitution itself embraces. Secondly, Jennifer said we have a stronger opposition in South Africa. Yes, we do. The ANC still remains a majority party with 62% at the last election. So some of you will be saying, now let's wait for the local government elections and see what's happening then. And that is part of the democratic process. So let's see what the will of the people says when those elections take place. But what I've been saying recently in South Africa is something I think is worthy of repetition here. That the ANC is 104 years old. And it's an organization that has had to survive many trials and tribulations over the 104 years. There's something in its genes, if you like, which enables the ANC to always survive these sorts of tribulations and make the right decisions in the interest both of itself and, more importantly, of the country as well. And I'm convinced that we can actually move in that particular direction. And so, although we are going through a difficult time, South Africa is a country that you can characterize with two words: hope and resilience. And I believe that those two factors will both guide us through and inspire us to cope with the current challenges, both external, on the continent, and within our own country, and come out better at the end of this particular troublesome period. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll open up the floor for questions. I think we'll take 3 at a time. Thank you very much for that, which opens it up. A question that I have, and you mentioned when talking about the global context, these interest hubs. And it strikes me that within South Africa, too, there are interest hubs. And many seem to see the economy as kind of a zero-sum game. Either it's growth or it's social programming, either it's labor versus unemployed, protecting labor versus unemployed, managers versus workers, university students versus investments in primary and secondary education. And I think balancing those various competing interests is going to be the big challenge ahead. And I wonder how, part of that is communicating a message of kind of win-win, but there are going to be those who are disgruntled at the direction. I wonder what is your worst fear as you kind of roll out some of the initiatives in power that you've laid out here and in the budget speech, where you think you might encounter kind of difficult trade-offs?
Well, finance minister's job is always difficult because there's always less money than that which is demanded. And usually we are oversubscribed by about a third. So if you have R1 trillion to spend, based on revenue and borrowing numbers, you can be assured the demands will be 300 billion and above for budgetary support. So as one very experienced finance minister once told me, our stock of trade is the word no. and that if you can say it carefully and accurately, you can survive. So those trade-offs are part and parcel of decision making that any government will have to undertake. And there will be surprises that we will be confronted with. So there were two that we had to cope with, both of which you've mentioned. One is the drought. And so in our planning for this financial year, we've set aside money for drought and for other contingencies as well in the contingency amount in our budget. And that's, I think, about 6 billion for the current financial year. And so we'll be able to absorb most of the shock and help farmers and so on to the extent necessary as far as drought is concerned. The second was university fees. And the whole movement, which was most welcome because it got young people engaged on issues that both concern them, but also hopefully over time they'll begin to appreciate that there's trade-offs between what we can do for them and what we need to do for the broader society. And so there's an understanding now that what government can offer in the short term is a 0% increase in fees for this year. And what we now need to do is to focus on how do we do it on a sustained basis. And it must be done in a way in which it addresses the limited resources we have addressed to poor students who come from poor families. So if we generalize it, then it becomes something that's unsustainable and certainly unmanageable. Equally, we recognize that in a fiscally constrained environment, in a low-growth environment, government doesn't have all the resources itself, for example, to invest in infrastructure or certain other areas that might be demanded. And so we through this period that I've just been describing, have been very carefully but energetically pursuing how do we mobilize private capital into government projects. The term that we use is co-invest. How do we co-invest? How do we create opportunities for private sector investment? And on the energy front, my colleague, the Minister of Energy, either just has or is about to announce a completion of all the bureaucratic processes that are involved in getting independent power producers to come into coal and gas generated energy. And that will bring in private sector involvement. And there's also now a regulatory framework that would allow for cogeneration by the private sector. So if you have a 250 megawatt plant created by a mine, that's good. They can sell some of that energy if it's surplus into the grid. And one of the issues that we have to address is the distribution network, the transmission network within that Mr. Banda left behind. And and so that area of investment is another area that we're looking at in terms of enhancing the quality of our network in order that renewables and other co-generated energy where they're not required or surplus can be fed into the grid.
Let's take a round of questions and we'll come back. The gentleman on the aisle first. And if you could state your name and affiliation.
Yeah, Williams Dumont, Atlas Consulting. Thank you for your brief words from the beginning. I have two questions. The first one pertains, you've talked briefly about the hydro projects. I know your neighbor is working on a massive project, I guess a third phase of the Inga project. If you could comment on the reality of this project coming to fruition. And forgot the second one. I'll give you a break.
Okay.
Only on the one. Oh, no. Now it's coming back.
Okay.
It happens to all of us, don't worry.
Yes. The second one is your impression, maybe not personally, but maybe for the government, of the status of the BRICS initiative and where's South Africa standing on the reality of this organization, growing or dying of good health. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Gibbs up front. Microphone's coming, it's for the webcast.
Minister, thank you for those wonderful remarks. You may have noticed we're having an election here in the United States.
Who can miss it?
If you were asked to advise President Trump, President Clinton, or President Cruz on what they would like
Where's
to
Sanders?
see. Bernie, sorry. My biases are coming through. I tried to be nonpartisan. But, on what you'd like to see them do vis-a-vis Africa policy and how they could help the continent realize its potential. Are there changes? What types of things would you like to see?
And then the gentleman in the far back.
Yes, hi, my name is Kevin Wensing. I'm at the National Press Club. Quick question on the demographics of Africa overall, the continent. About 1 billion people right now. Some forecasts say 3-4 billion by 2100. How's that come into your planning and so forth?
Should we start with those and we'll come back for another round?
On Inga, I think there's more and more interest in the project. There's a clearer understanding of what the DRC needs to do to create the right kind of climate. There's also, if you like, a gelling of understanding amongst different types of investors from the US, from China, and from multilateral banks and institutions on the one hand, and on the other hand, a recognition that if the project can be made a reality, it'll make a huge difference both to Central Africa and the rest of the continent as well. So it hasn't died off. It might take a little bit more time to bear fruit, but the US project, for example, on Africa, Power Africa, is but one example of interest, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes talking and envisioning of what would be required to create the kind of environment which a big project like this requires, including, for example, when transmission lines, I had this discussion recently with somebody, transmission lines will be crossing different countries. So who owns them? Who repairs them? Where will the money come from? So we've gone, I think, beyond the more general conversation now to particularities. And starting engaging with a solutions approach to some of those propositions. Similarly, on the BRICS initiative, you now have two, certainly on the economic side, two very concrete outcomes that have been achieved in a remarkably short period of time. One is the new development bank. We talked about it during my first term. It's now a reality. The head office is established. Your management structures are in place. There's hiring of new people taking place. Meetings will soon be held to actually determine the first set of loans that will actually be given and for which projects amongst the 5 founding countries. So by the end of this year, we will see concrete projects being adopted and beginning to get the funding that they require.
Is there money in the bank?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No. We paid our share too. And then there's a contingency reserve arrangement, which has also taken shape. It's established institutionally speaking, and the reserve banks or central banks of various countries are the guardians of that particular process. later tomorrow, one will get a more concrete understanding of what the next steps are in that regard. But given our current economic climate, projects like the CRA, for example, become quite important, which is then linked to Donald Gibbs' question about what the incoming president of the United States, whoever it might be, and I don't want to expose my preferences, should have as their priority, or his or her priority. The first is to recognize that Africa is still the continent of the future. And this relates to the third question as well, that demographically speaking, it is still the youngest continent. It's going to provide a huge market. It still has the beginnings of becoming a new production center of the world. Countries like Ethiopia and others are beginning to demonstrate that in concrete terms. And so don't lose the Africa focus, firstly. Secondly, encourage long-term investment in Africa, as opposed to looking for quick yields, because quick yields is what is causing, I think, a lot of despair and instability around the world, the search for it. What we now require is something that we've been now talking for about 6 years, which is long-term commitment and long-term investment. There are many US companies that have a long-term presence on the African continent, and new ones that are establishing a new presence, but again for the long term and not just a short-term visit to Africa. The third is that in the current environment where there is a resource shortage, don't move away from supporting the multilateral institutions, both in terms of supply of capital, but also in terms of where the capital is allocated, so that we, as I said earlier on in my remarks, don't become distracted by the crises and forget the long-term developmental trajectory that continents like Africa certainly require. And in the current period, we're going to have, as a result of the drop in oil price, the result in the drop of other commodity prices and demand as well, short-term challenges that many commodity-producing countries will have on the fiscal or the monetary or both on the macroeconomic side. We need to find and encourage the multilateral institutions to be a lot more patient, to be a lot more creative, and a lot more flexible in providing assistance to these countries without being stigmatized in any kind of way. And then let's get a better exchange of ideas, but also new types of partnerships developing, which will encourage better growth, better inclusiveness, and prospects for the large number of young people on the African continent. And encourage the rest of the world to not become participants in any kind of conflict area in Africa. Let Africa find its own peace, so that we can create the kind of stability that is required in order to generate growth. How is the demographics fitting into planning? Pretty much like I've said already. I think both ourselves as Africans and those who want to partner with us need to take a longer term view. Secondly, understand, as we did about 4 years ago, we used to talk about Africa as an important pole of growth and demand and development. I think we need to return to that kind of narrative, not just be subsumed into descending down a spiral where none of us benefits at the end of the day. In other words, I'm better than you, I've got 2%, you've got 0.5, or whatever the case might be, or you've declined from 5 point something down to 3 point something, therefore you're no longer a growth prospect as you used to be. And of course, we will be battling against all the instincts and practices of short-termism that the world is requiring of financial markets and companies. When we say make a long-term commitment based on those demographics and the potential that Africa actually has. And I know that there would be many consumer-oriented companies that are on top of that game. They understand, I won't name them, but they actually understand that if they want to expand their markets, here's a continent that A, has already proven so, and B, holds a huge amount of potential into the future.
Great, thank you.
Now I'm in trouble.
Okay, yeah. Enos, we'll start with you.
Minister, it's nice to see you, and I wanted to assure you my two questions will demonstrate I've not abandoned either country or transmission. So the questions really, one is personal and one is of a culture, a broader nature. You've spoken about the IPPs on the generation side, and for people looking at investment in the transmission space, and this is something that we are seriously considering, is what is the government's plans for creating the enabling environment. We understand that there's about between 15 and $20 billion worth of transmission that needs to be made, investment to be made in transmission in South Africa. And so how to engage the private sector and the regulatory framework for that. The second one, for my sins, I'm the chairperson of the South African Chamber of Commerce in America, supporting South African businesses wishing to engage with this market. And one of the issues that we're looking at is AGOA. We know that it's a hard-fought battle between our country and the United States in terms of AGOA. But we look at that as potentially having a transformative effect by providing an opportunity for emerging entrepreneurs to look at the United States as a market into which they can grow their businesses in South Africa for export into the US. I wanted to understand whether, in terms of the investment programs of government, whether anything substantial to reap the rewards of AGOA at a macroeconomic and at a transformative level, whether anything is being planned in that regard. Thanks, Minister.
We'll go to Tony and then Ambassador Cohen. Right.
Thank you, Minister. Welcome to Washington. I'd like to perhaps get your thoughts on the state of local governance in South Africa. One is, as a frequent visitor for over 40 years to South Africa and certainly lover of your country and its manifestations, one is struck by the unevenness in delivery of services at the local level. And I'm just wondering, how worried are you about that? Do you feel there are fiscal reforms, perhaps taxation at a local level that might inspire better governance? I'm just sort of curious at your thoughts in this area because I know that you've worked in it before.
And Ambassador Cohen, or Jonathan.
Good afternoon, Minister. I'm a retired U.S. diplomat, and now I'm working exclusively on IPPs for Africa. And I've taken note of what you said about opening coal and gas in South Africa. That's very significant. But my question is, are you satisfied with the progress made in the education sector since independence?
Good question. Shall we come back to that round?
Should we take two more?
Two more, okay. The gentleman there, and then we'll take the lady in the blues.
Mr. Minister, I'm Tom Getman. I am a consultant in South Africa and in the Middle East after years on the Hill and in the development community. In consultations, my name is Tom Getman. In consultations at Lily's Leaf 2 weeks ago, many of your colleagues were indeed encouraged by the Constitutional Court's resilience and the Public Protector. But they also mentioned encouraged by your ministry. And in light of that, I'm wondering if you had any role in the appointment of one of your colleagues, the Minister of Agriculture, to do work on land distribution. And a lot of young people that I came across are very interested in how that policy will develop and who's going to be involved in the decision making.
And right behind you.
Thank you. Minister, hello. My name is Isabel Munilla, and I work with the Oil and Mining Department at Oxfam. We have an office in South Africa, and my question is around the fall in commodities prices obviously increases instability. There we're concerned in South Africa about the lack of public trust and the extent of economic contributions by companies in South Africa. Obviously the fall in commodities prices makes every cent paid even more precious, and tax collection efforts by SARS even more important. The previous Minister of Mines, as well as Anglo American, have endorsed an approach on transparency that's been adopted by Canada, the EU, and the US. This was an approach, I believe, that was also examined by the Davis Tax Committee Mining Subcommittee. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that approach, your thoughts about it, and the role of the Davis Tax Committee in addressing some of these issues, as they've been doing quite good work over the past couple of years after you helped set them up back in 2013. Thank you.
Well, let's start with the last one. I think the whole issue of BEPS, as it is called, base erosion and profit shifting, more generally transfer pricing, and even more generally the illicit flows of finance across the globe, and the deep concerns that the African continent has, on which there are many reports. So there's no shortage of data, speculation, or extrapolations or estimations of one kind or of another as to how much of money that should remain in the continent and be invested in the continent actually finds its way elsewhere. And I had one word written in my earlier note which I didn't address, called Panama. Yes. And I think the events of the last few weeks around the leakage of documents from that country, I'm not sure to what extent it affects the United States. There are actually very few South Africans who seem to have their names on that list, but it's a phenomenon that's important. And that phenomenon is one of being able to still utilize in the 21st century this animal called tax havens in order to illegitimately evade one's responsibility to the fiscus of each of the countries. And one can only imagine if the money that is lying around in these tax havens had actually remained in the country where they were supposed to and contributed to the fiscus in a fair and legitimate kind of way and utilized properly as well, so we must grant that as governments, how much of a difference would that have made, both to the economic and social well-being of people in those countries? And I think that ultimately is what should drive all of us to encourage greater transparency, more openness, a harmonization of the rules of the game, which the G20 and in particular the OECD has done well to put on the global agenda, but it's still, I think, very early days and very tentative steps that require, on the one hand, a lot more fine-tuning, and on the other hand, enforcement capability, which I suppose exchange of information meets to some extent, but not adequately at this point in time. But above all, it requires a new morality, if there's such a thing, in business. And perhaps that's the topic that you need to look at. Do morality and business go together? I'm sure they do. And I'm sure they are very honest business people who want to do the right thing and play by the rules of the game. And if we don't, it has serious consequences, as you can see, because many countries today that require fiscal stimuli are unable to enter that terrain, either through their own doing or because of the kind of factors that are impinging upon them both externally and internally. The Davis Tax Committee in South Africa is doing very interesting work, both more generally and in this area, and will continue to do that work in the coming period. I'm hoping to meet Judge Davis here, actually, in Washington in the next few days. And that will help us to lift the game on the South African side. We did some exciting work in the last, say, 10 years or so, but I think the game has to be raised to a completely different level. New loopholes have been created by a whole industry, as you know, of tax planners, whether they're accountants, lawyers, or others. And if governments don't develop the right kind of capability, on the one hand, but also begin to challenge businesses in terms of what is right and what is wrong, then we will all be playing a losing game at the end of the day. In terms of land distribution, we have many programs in government already that involve land reform, land restitution. There are various institutions, land claims courts, the Department of Rural Development and Land Affairs, which are involved in this area. And there's some regulatory changes that are taking place, which my colleague Minister Nkwinti is actually looking at, But when we link the land distribution question to agriculture and productivity, I think as South Africa, we haven't done well enough in that area. So you can give off a parcel of land, but we've realized that you need to give a lot more than a parcel of land. You need to give technical support and other forms of assistance in order that smallholder or bigger farms can actually get off the ground. And that's the area which in the coming years we intend to focus on, learn from others, bring in the kind of technical expertise that we require in order to take agriculture, which has the potential to employ lots of people, and also increase the intensity of agro-processing in our own country, and exploit that particular potential. On education, we've done well to give access to a whole lot of South Africans that never had access. We've built more schools than we probably ever have in the history of the country. We now need to move on to the next phase, and the next phase is the quality of education. And whether it's the quality of input or the quality of output, better prepared students, better cooperation in terms of vocational training between business and government, so that younger people move out of educational institutions with the right kind of skills and exposure to real work environments, which in many advanced economies is taken for granted. In our economy, we had some of that present some years ago. We lost it a bit, and we're in the process of recreating the institutions that are required to give us the kind of outputs that we require. In many ways, much of the infrastructure exists, although much of it also needs to be created. For example, the capacity of our medical schools need to be expanded threefold, so the Minister of Health is looking into that area. Vocational training institutions exist, but the quality of teaching and exposure to work is not as adequate as it actually should be. So that's an area that requires work as well. And we're very aware, so this is no secret, that this is the next phase in a 20-year-old democracy that we need to move on to. On local government, these are relatively new institutions. Remembering that we are a 20-year-old democracy. So institutionally speaking, we've done reasonably well. In this period, we are once again reducing the number of municipalities that we have in South Africa. So by the time we have elections, I think we'll be down to about 260 odd municipalities. 20 years ago, there were 400 or 500 municipalities. The service is uneven because the skills levels and the fiscal capacity of local government institutions is different. We work on the premise that every municipality should be able to generate a fair amount of its own resources through rates, other forms of taxes, surcharges, and so on. But in the far-flung areas of our country, the rural municipalities are unable to do that. And although we have what we call an equitable share of revenue distributed amongst municipalities to the tune of about 9% of our overall budget, which is about between 90 and 100 billion rands this financial year. That's not enough to cater for that narrow band of municipalities that are unable to actually generate the right kind of revenue. But we must also be frank that sometimes in these municipalities we hire the wrong people. The political leadership doesn't give the kind of direction and decision-making that is actually required, and those are areas which in my in-between job, last job as finance minister and this one, I was making a contribution to, and we introduced a program called Back to Basics. In other words, if every municipality did 5 or 10 basic things well, the rest will begin to come, because you'll start playing the right kind of constructive role. I mean, the global narrative, and one which we are getting to in South Africa as well, is that municipalities or cities and towns are quite crucial for economic development as well. And there needs to be a higher level of self-awareness about the regulatory environment in municipalities. There's an interesting report that the World Bank produced last year on our 8 metropolitan municipalities called Doing Business in Municipalities, I think. And that gave us objective data about who does well at what. How long does it take to get electricity connections? How long does it take to pass an amendment to a plan that you might have, or rezoning of land. And we are now working harder at ensuring that municipalities begin to take that kind of responsibility upon themselves. On the question of transmission lines, that's beginning to receive attention on our side. And hopefully soon we'll be able to be a lot more clear about where we hope to get that money from, 15 to 20 billion that you make reference to. As you know, many would say it's far more important to own the transmission infrastructure than the generating infrastructure. So I think that will become part of the debate in South Africa as well, because electricity at one level is a public good, and one needs to manage this in a careful way. And the last point around AGOA, governments can create an enabling environment. At the end of the day, it's the kind of business culture that you find in emerging in society itself that will determine what entrepreneurs develop and how far they go. And a lot of our discussion, even with established business in the last couple of months, has been about how they could help to train people, mentor people, maybe even provide some kind of financing, and ensure that they create marketing opportunities, amongst other things, in order to get the emerging entrepreneurs to be able to reap the rewards, like you say. It's not going to happen overnight. It requires huge structural factors to be taken into account, and at the same time, it's something that we need to attend to in order to ensure that those who've been marginalized economically get opportunities in the new South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at time, and the minister is due at another meeting shortly. Minister Gordhan, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I take a couple of points away. Long-term versus crisis-driven responses. That's always a tricky one for U.S. policymakers, but one that's well taken. Hope and resilience in South Africa. And on the international financial, the Panama Papers and so forth, the U.S. is not exactly a model in that. And I think that's something that we need to think hard about. And I hope we'll do that at CSIS.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and let me wish you luck in your politics.